What if I told you that the greatest secret in the history of rock music was revealed exactly 24 hours before its keeper went silent forever? What if I told you that the loudest silence in the history of show business was broken not by a cry for help, but by a cold, calculated whisper that rang out louder than any Brian May guitar riff? November 1991. London is drowning in a gray, icy rain that seems to wash the color right out of the streets of Kensington. But there is one place where the darkness has gathered thickest. Garden Lodge. High brick walls, topped with razor wire, usually served as protection from prying eyes, but in these days they have turned into the walls of a fortress under siege. Inside, in a bedroom with heavy curtains drawn tight, lies a man. He is blind. He can barely speak. His body, which was once a ball of pure electric energy capable of igniting a stadium of 100,000 people, now weighs less than that of a teenager. Every breath is a struggle. Every movement causes pain that cannot be described in words. But outside, at the gates of his home, an army is stationed. These are not fans coming to pay their respects. These are hunters. Tabloid journalists, photographers with long focus lenses looking like sniper rifles, reporters ready to pay any amount of money for a single shot. A shot of the dying star, a shot of the monster. They thought they had him cornered. They thought he was their prey, a trapped animal hiding in its burrow, trembling with fear of inevitable exposure. They were sure they would steal his story, turning his death into a dirty, sensational headline that would sell millions of papers. But they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the man lying behind those walls. They forgot that Freddie Mercury never played by other people's rules. Even on his deathbed, when his physical shell was destroyed, his spirit remained the spirit of a king. He made a move that stunned the world, a move that made millions of people freeze in shock, and then weep with a mixture of horror and admiration. He decided to speak, but what he was about to say was not a plea for pity, nor was it a sinner's confession. It was the final, deafening chord of his life, directed with the precision of a genius playwright. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon, because we reveal the hidden gems that shaped the legends we know today. To truly feel the weight of this moment, you need to transport yourself back to that night. Forget for a second that you know how it ends. Imagine you are standing there in the rain, among the crowd of reporters. The air is electrified. Rumors of Freddy's illness had been circulating for years, but no one knew the truth for sure. It was Britain's most guarded secret. The Sun ran headlines. Is the King of Queen dying? Star's secret plague. But they had no proof. Only guesses. Only photos of a gaunt man in dark glasses, taken by stealth. And this uncertainty was driving them mad. They hungered for confirmation. They hungered for blood. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, peering into the mansion's windows, hoping to see even a shadow, a silhouette. They bribed garbage men to bring them the contents of the bins from Garden Lodge, hoping to find medicine packaging that would confirm the diagnosis. Can you imagine that level of cynicism? Digging through a dying man's dirty laundry to sell a paper for 20 pence. Now, let's transport inside, into the Holy of Holies, into the bedroom where time seemed to have stopped. There was no chaos there. There was silence, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of sleep. It was the calm before the storm. Freddy lay on a mountain of pillows. Next to him, on the nightstand, stood a glass of water he could no longer reach, and a pack of strong painkillers that barely helped anymore. The room smelled of expensive lilies, his favorite flowers, and the elusive, sterile scent of a hospital. Sitting beside him were his closest circle, his former lover and eternal friend Mary Austin, his partner Jim Hutton, his personal assistant Peter Freestone. They took turns keeping vigil at his bedside, holding his hand, moistening his parched lips. They saw what the world didn't see, how the disease was devouring his flesh, leaving only his eyes. Those same eyes where a fire still burned, but now it was a fire of fury and resolve. Freddy knew the end was near. The doctors had stopped giving forecasts in months. Now the countdown was in hours. He made the decision to stop taking all medication, except for pain relief. It was his choice. The choice of a man who wants to go out on his own terms, not prolong the agony for the sake of a ghostly hope. But there was one thing that gave him no peace. One unfinished detail: his silence. For 4 years, he had kept his diagnosis a secret. For 4 years, he lied to the press, lied to fans, lied even to some friends. "I'm fine. I'm just tired. It's an old knee injury. I just don't want to tour anymore." Why did he do it? Many accused him of cowardice. They said he was ashamed of his illness, that he was afraid of losing the public's love. But have you ever wondered what really drove him? Imagine you are Freddie Mercury. You are a god of the stage. You are the man who made the whole world sing, "We are the champions." And suddenly you find out there's a ticking time bomb inside you. You know that as soon as you say the word AIDS, your life is over. Not physically, no. Your life as a musician will end. You will become a patient. You will become a victim. You will become the face of a campaign, a poster, a statistic. Pity. That is what he feared more than death. He knew that if he confessed earlier, people would buy his records not because the music was brilliant, but because they felt sorry for poor Freddy. And for a proud Persian, for an artist to the bone, that was worse than any curse. He wanted people to listen to innuendo and hear the music, not the diagnosis, and he achieved that. He recorded his final masterpieces while already having one foot in the grave, and no one knew the price he paid for every note. But now, in this dark room, listening to the sound of the rain and the hum of voices beyond the wall, he realized the game is over. He bought time. He recorded the music. He protected his loved ones as much as he could. But the final act remained, the final encore. He understood that if he died in silence, the tabloids would write his story for him. They would turn his death into a dirty scandal. They would write that he hid the disease out of fear and shame. They would desecrate his memory with speculation. And then, gathering the last scraps of strength he had left, he decided to seize the initiative. He decided that he would write his own obituary, right now, while his heart was still beating. This was the moment of truth, the moment when the victim turns into the master of the situation. Do you think he cried? Do you think he trembled? No. The moment he called for Jim Beach, Queen's manager, there was steel in his fading voice, the same steel that rang in his voice when he sang, "The show must go on." He couldn't stand up. He couldn't see Jim's face, but his mind was as clear as a frosty morning. He knew what he was doing. This was not a surrender. This was a strategic strike. Checkmate to the press, who were already rubbing their hands in anticipation of a sensation. Jim Beach entered the room. He sat by the bed, took out a notepad and that gold pen. Silence hung in the room, broken only by Freddy's heavy breathing. It seemed history itself froze in anticipation. What would he say? Would he apologize? Would he ask for forgiveness for his wild lifestyle, as the morality of that time demanded? Would he beg for understanding? Anyone else in his place would have broken. Anyone else would have tried to justify themselves to a world that judged him so cruelly. But Freddy was cut from different cloth. He began to dictate, slowly, with pauses to draw air into destroyed lungs. But every word fell into the silence of the room like a heavy stone, creating ripples that would soon reach the most remote corners of the planet. In that moment, an amazing transformation was taking place. The man confined to his bed became once again the giant who commanded the crowd at Live Aid. He was directing his death just as carefully as he directed his shows. He knew that this statement would be the last thing the world would hear from him, and he wasn't going to waste these words on banalities. He was going to use them as a weapon against ignorance, a weapon against stigma, a weapon against those who considered him filthy. He was creating a document that was meant to change the world's attitude toward this terrible disease. He, the dying man, wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his legacy. Have you ever seen a man who has had everything taken away, health, beauty, sight, strength, suddenly gain a greatness that cannot be taken? That is exactly what was happening in the bedroom at Garden Lodge. Jim Beach wrote, barely holding back tears. He understood he was writing history. He understood that tomorrow, when these words were published, the world would change forever. But he also understood something else, something that made his heart clench. He knew that this statement was not the beginning of a new fight. It was a goodbye. Freddie was not intending to lead foundations or give interviews about his illness. He wasn't making this statement to live on. He was making it to die in peace. Outside, the rain intensified. Journalists wrapped themselves in raincoats, cursing the weather and the stubborn star who wouldn't give them a scoop. They didn't know that at this very moment, just a few meters away from them, behind thick walls and velvet curtains, the scoop was already being born. But it wouldn't be what they expected. It wouldn't be an admission of defeat. It would be a slap in the face to their cynicism. Freddie was preparing a surprise for them. He was going to leave by slamming the door loudly, leaving them with their mouths open and perhaps, for the first time in their lives, with a sense of shame. He was going to show them what true dignity looks like in the face of the inevitable. And when Jim Beach put the period at the end of the page, Freddie exhaled. For the first time in many months, an expression of deep, absolute peace appeared on his face. The deed was done. The script was written, and only the finale remained to be played. And he was ready. He had been waiting for this moment. He had made death wait in the hallway while he finished his business, and now that the last word was said, he was ready to open the door for her. But the world was not yet ready for what it was about to hear tomorrow morning. To understand the magnitude of this moment, to truly realize what titanic willpower was required for that single decision, we need to step out of this quiet, lily-scented bedroom and step into the cold, wet London night. We must find ourselves on the other side of the high brick wall circling Garden Lodge, because right there, on the wet asphalt of Logan Place, one of the most shameful and brutal dramas in the history of modern journalism was unfolding. If inside the house there was an atmosphere of mournful peace, outside there was a real war. And that is not a metaphor. It was a siege in medieval style, only instead of catapults and battering rams, they used telephoto lenses costing as much as a sports car and checkbooks ready to write any amount for betrayal. Do you think you know what paparazzi are? Have you seen how they chased Britney Spears or Princess Diana? Forget it. What was happening at Freddie Mercury's house in November 1991 was something else. It wasn't just a hunt for a sensation. It was a vigil of vultures who knew exactly that the prey would soon breathe its last, and feared only one thing, missing the moment when the king's heart stopped. Picture this scene. A narrow street in the prestigious district of Kensington, usually quiet, respectable, where diplomats and bankers live. But in these days, it had turned into a refugee camp or a combat zone. Dozens of cars parked bumper to bumper, people sleeping in cabins, taking turns, drinking cheap coffee from thermoses, smoking one cigarette after another. The air was thick with nervousness and cynicism. Photographers from the world's biggest tabloids, The Sun, the Daily Mirror, News of the World, had made an unspoken pact. No one leaves, no one sleeps. If the gates open even an inch, hundreds of flashes must fire simultaneously, turning night into day. Why? What for all this madness? For one shot. A shot that would show the monster. They didn't want Freddy the star. They wanted Freddy the skeleton. They wanted to see the lesions on his face. They wanted to see the fear in his eyes. The market price for such a picture at that moment was estimated at £50,000 sterling. Think about that. £50,000 for proof that a man is dying. That was the price of human dignity in 1991. But the most terrifying things weren't happening on the street. The most terrifying things were happening in the shadows, in the back rooms, where deals with conscience were made. The journalists weren't just waiting. They were acting. They were looking for rats. You can't even imagine the tricks they resorted to. They approached nurses coming to set up IVs and whispered, "Just tell us, is he wetting the bed? Say yes, and we'll pay off your mortgage." They staked out food delivery drivers. They tried to bribe the maids. There were cases where reporters dug through garbage bins taken from the mansion grounds, tearing open black bags with their bare hands in search of empty boxes of AZT, the drug used then to slow the progress of AIDS. They looked for evidence like forensic scientists at a crime scene. Only there was no crime. There was just a man who wanted to die in his own bed, not on the cover of a yellow newspaper. And this aggression, this inhuman persistence of the press, created a paradox. The harder they pushed, the tighter the ranks of Freddy's defenders closed. Inside the house, behind those walls that shuddered at every shout from the street, existed another world. A world of absolute loyalty. Freddy's inner circle, Mary Austin, Jim Hutton, Peter Freestone, Joe Finelli, turned into a Praetorian Guard. They lived in a state of constant combat readiness. Every phone call could be a trap. Every knock at the door could be a provocation. They stopped trusting anyone outside the house. They went to the pharmacy themselves, buying medicine in different places so no one could piece together the full picture of the treatment. They cooked the food themselves. They became a living shield between Freddy and the world that wanted to devour him. But have you ever wondered what it's like to live in a golden cage, knowing that outside they hate you for being sick? Freddy knew. He heard them. His bedroom was on the second floor, and even through heavy curtains and triple-paned windows, the hum of the crowd reached him. He couldn't see them. His vision had almost faded by then, leaving only blurred shadows, but he felt their presence with his skin. He felt that greedy, sticky energy seeping through the brick. And here arises the question that tormented everyone. Why did he stay silent? Why did he endure this siege? After all, he could have stopped it at any moment. One statement 6 months ago, and the hype would have died down. People would have learned the truth, cried, and left him alone. So why did he drag it out until the last second? Was it pride? Was it shame? Many thought so. Newspapers wrote, "Mercury is afraid to confess because he is ashamed of his depraved past." What a monstrous lie that was. They judged him by themselves. They thought he was playing hide and seek, but he was playing chess with eternity. Do you think you understand his motives? Do you think he was protecting his reputation? No. Flip that thought. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting US. He was protecting the magic. Freddie Mercury was above all a creator of illusions. He knew the cardinal rule of show business. As soon as the audience sees the magician backstage without makeup, the magic disappears. If he had confessed in 1987, when he was diagnosed, every Queen album released after that, the miracle innuendo, would have been perceived through the prism of pity. Critics would have written not about the genius of the harmonies, but about death rattles. Fans would listen to "The Show Must Go On" and hear not an anthem of spiritual strength, but a medical chart. Freddy couldn't allow that. He wanted his music to remain pure. He wanted us to listen to his voice, not count his white blood cells. His silence was an act of the greatest self-sacrifice. He took the blow of hatred and speculation. He allowed himself to be called a liar, just so his art would remain untouchable until the very end. But in that November of 1991, the situation changed. The equation he had been solving for 4 years got new variables. He could no longer record music. He could no longer stand at the microphone. The physical shell had failed. The art was complete. And now another task came to the fore. A task he thought about while lying in the darkness of his bedroom. He realized that if he died silent, they would win. Those standing outside the gates, those digging in the trash, they would write his story. They would tell the world that Freddie Mercury died in fear and denial. They would turn his tragedy into a farce, and that thought was unbearable to him. He, the man who controlled every aspect of his show, from costumes to lighting, could not allow the finale of his life to be directed by some nameless tabloid editor. Do you feel this turning point, the moment when the victim stops being a victim? Freddie lay on the pillows, his body broken by pain, but his mind worked with the cold clarity of a commander. He realized that the silence, which used to be his shield, had now become his vulnerability. The shield had to be discarded, the sword had to be drawn, and that sword had to be the truth. But the truth spoken on his terms, at his time, and with his intonation. He decided to use the very press that hunted him against itself. He decided to feed them a sensation, but one that would stick in their throats. This was not desperation. This was the final, genius performance. He knew he had hours left to live. He felt life draining out of him drop by drop. And it was this knowledge that gave him incredible freedom. He had nothing left to lose. He didn't need to fear for album sales. He didn't need to fear judgment. He was already 1 foot in eternity. And from there, from the threshold of non-existence, he looked at the bustle outside the window, at those vultures with cameras, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, he smiled. Smiled that famous, slightly ironic Freddy smile. Because he knew. Tomorrow morning, he would flip the board. Tomorrow morning, he would make them all shut up. But how exactly to do it? How to find words that won't sound like an excuse? How to say, I am dying, but make it sound like I won? Shadows thickened in the room. Jim Beach hadn't arrived yet. The gold pen was still in its case. Freddie was alone with his thoughts, and with the pain that in the last hours had become his only constant companion. He gathered his strength. He hoarded energy for the final push. Outside, rain drummed on the roofs of the paparazzi cars, washing the dirt off the London streets, but it couldn't wash the dirt off their intentions. They waited for death, and Freddie was preparing life for them, life in truth. And this contrast between the crowd's expectations and the genius's plan created that very electric tension that would blow up the whole world in a few hours. No one knew the fuse was already lit. No one knew that history was already being written in this quiet bedroom. Everyone looked at the closed gates, thinking it was the end, but it was only the beginning of the finale. Remember this object. Burn its image into your memory, because history is often made not by swords or cannons, but by things that seem ridiculously mundane. At the center of this scene, in the epicenter of the hurricane that is about to blow the roof off global show business, is not a microphone and not a piano. It is a gold fountain pen, heavy, expensive, coldly gleaming in the dim light of the night lamp on the polished mahogany surface. It lies there like a loaded gun left in plain sight. Next to it is a clean, blindingly white sheet of paper, which looks almost defiant in this room soaked in shadows and the scent of fading lilies. Usually, such pens are used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts, buy islands, or certify wills. But on this evening, this piece of gold and metal had a different mission. It was to become a scalpel, an instrument with which a dying man was about to lance the boil that had tormented him and the whole world for 4 years. And the most paradoxical thing about this situation was that the man who owned this pen could no longer hold it. Look at the bed. On a mountain of pillows, in a semi-sitting position, is Freddie Mercury. If you entered the room at that moment, you might have recoiled. This was not the Freddy you remember in the yellow jacket at Wembley. Disease is a cruel sculptor. It cuts away everything superfluous. But in Freddy's case, it seemed trying to erase his very essence. His hands trembled so violently he couldn't lift a glass of water to his lips on his own. His vision, the very vision that once assessed The scale of stadiums now failed him. He saw only blurred silhouettes, shadows, dancing on the walls. But inside this destroyed shell, in this fragile body that weighed less than a child's, a nuclear reactor was working. His mind, his will. Do you think he was broken? Do you think he lay there awaiting the end in fear? Oh, how wrong you are. In this moment, he was more composed and dangerous than ever. He couldn't right himself, but he needed hands. And those hands belonged to the man sitting next to him on the edge of the bed. Jim Beach, Queen's manager, lawyer, a man in a strict suit who was used to solving problems with taxes, copyrights, and tour logistics. He had seen Freddie in moments of greatest triumphs, bathing in champagne and the crowd's love. Now he saw him in a moment of greatest vulnerability. But Jim didn't cry. He knew Freddie hated tears. Freddie despised pity. If Jim had allowed himself even one tear, the magic of the moment would have been broken. So Jim sat straight, stone-faced, ready to execute the final order of his client, his friend, his brother. He took the gold pen. The metal warmed in his fingers. He pulled the sheet of paper closer, and a silence hung in the room, so dense it felt like you could cut it with a knife. This wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence before a gunshot. Have you ever wondered what a person feels who is about to destroy their own legend to save their soul? Freddie knew that once these words were written and sent, there would be no turning back. He couldn't change his mind. He couldn't say, "It was a mistake." This sheet of paper would become a historical document. It would become something quoted in encyclopedias in 100 years. Usually stars in such situations hire an army of PR people. They write long, vague texts, full of euphemisms, smooth the corners, try to manipulate public opinion. He is tired. He is taking a break. Lies, wrapped in a pretty package. But Freddie was going to do something that contradicted all laws of PR. He was going to tell the truth. The naked, terrible, uncomfortable truth. Without embellishment. Without attempts to garner sympathy. He was going to use words as a weapon, and he was aiming straight at the heart of the hypocrisy that had surrounded his final years. "Jim," he whispered, and his voice, though quiet, wheezing due to pneumonia, sounded like a general's command. "It's time. Write it down." The pen touched the paper. The scratching of the nib on the sheet in that silence sounded louder than an explosion. Freddie closed his sightless eyes, gathering his thoughts. He hadn't prepared a speech. He had no drafts. Everything he was about to say had been suffered through by him over thousands of sleepless nights. He formulated these phrases in his head while lying in the dark, listening to the disease devour his body. And now these words, like molten lava, were ready to burst out. But why exactly now? Why not a week ago? Why not tomorrow? Because Freddie was a master of timing. He felt the rhythm of life just as flawlessly as he felt the rhythm of music. He knew his time was up. He had stopped taking life-sustaining medication, leaving only painkillers. It was his decision. He pressed the stop button on his life's player, but before the screen went dark completely, he wanted to leave the credits. In this moment, an amazing, almost mystical alchemy was taking place in the room. Jim Beach wrote, and his handwriting was even, professional, but inside him, everything was screaming. He realized he was writing an obituary for a living person. He realized that every word Freddie dictated brought the end closer. It was like digging a grave for your best friend, while he stood next to you, pointing out where to dig deeper. But Jim wrote. He didn't ask questions. He didn't suggest softening the wording. He was simply a conduit for Freddie's will, and in this obedience was the highest manifestation of respect. Freddie didn't need advice. He needed a witness. Now imagine what is going on in Freddie's head in these seconds. Do you think he was remembering his concerts? Montreux? Barcelona? No. In this moment, he was thinking about strategy. This was his final chess move. The Sun and other tabloids already had their headlines ready. They kept them in desk drawers, waiting for the signal. Headlines about the plague, about dirty death, about payment for sins. They wanted to dance on his bones. They wanted to turn his tragedy into a moralizing fable for Puritans. Freddie knew this, and he decided to beat them to it. He decided to pull the rug out from under them. If he told the truth himself, they would have no sensation left. They would have no dirty secret. He would turn their exclusive into old news before they even had time to print the run. It was an act of brilliant, vengeful genius. The dying lion was delivering the final blow to the jackals circling around him. "I want it to be simple," he whispered, pausing between words to gather air. "No drama, just facts, and dignity. Dignity, that is the key word. All his career he was a clown, a jester, a king, a god. But behind all these masks hid a man with an incredible sense of self-worth. And now, when the masks were ripped away by disease, this dignity became his only clothing. He didn't want to be remembered as a victim. He didn't want to be remembered as a liar. He wanted to leave with his head held high, even if physically he couldn't lift it from the pillow." Jim Beach finished the next sentence and looked up at Freddie. In the dim light, the singer's face looked like a wax mask. Nostrils flared. Cold sweat stood out on his forehead. This effort, just to speak, just to formulate thoughts, drained his last vital forces. But he didn't stop. "Keep going, Jim. We're not done yet." It was like recording vocals, for the show must go on. Then he drank vodka and went to the mic, overcoming pain. Now he had no vodka, and the gold pen served as the microphone, but the essence was the same. He had to finish this take, the perfect take, because there would be no second chance. It might seem to you like just writing a press release, but in the context of 1991, it was equivalent to signing a death warrant for oneself. Admitting to AIDS then meant becoming an outcast. People were afraid to touch the sick. They were kicked out of homes, fired from jobs. And here, the biggest star on the planet prepares to put on this yellow star. Voluntarily. 24 hours before death. Why? To protect those who remain. To protect Mary. To protect Jim Hutton. So that fans would learn the truth from him, not from dirty newspapers. It was an act of love. Strange, harsh, but infinite love for the people who made him who he was. When the last phrase was dictated, silence fell over the room again. But now it was different. It was the silence of completion. Jim Beach put the pen on the table. Gold clicked against wood. That sound put a period at the end of Freddie Mercury's career. No more songs. No more interviews. No more shows. Only a man preparing for his final journey remained. Freddie exhaled, and in that exhalation was the relief of a man who had thrown a heavy burden off his shoulders. He looked towards Jim with his unseeing eyes and seemed to give a barely perceptible nod. "Do it," he whispered. "Release it tomorrow." He didn't know what reaction would follow. He couldn't know that millions of people would cry, that candles would be lit all over the world, that his confession would change the attitude towards the disease forever. He just knew he did the right thing. He rewrote the ending of his own play. He didn't let circumstances dictate the terms. He remained the director until the very end. And when Jim Beach left the room, taking with him that sheet of paper, the most important document in the history of rock and roll, Freddie was left alone, alone with the darkness. But now that darkness didn't frighten him, because he had lit the light of truth in it, which no one could ever extinguish. But the world outside the window, those journalists in the rain, those fans listening to innuendo, they didn't know yet that the bomb was already activated, and the timer showed less than 24 hours. Do you think it was the confession of a defeated man? Do you think the man lying on sweat-soaked sheets finally broke under the weight of fear and decided to beg the world for forgiveness before leaving? If you think that, then you are making the same fatal mistake the editors of London tabloids made that night. This wasn't a confession. It was a strategic checkmate. In the room, where the only sound was Freddie's heavy, wheezing breath and the relentless, loud ticking of the clock, not a melodrama, was playing out, but a game of chess with death itself and its earthly representatives, the journalists. Freddie Mercury knew what no one else in this world knew, except perhaps his doctors. His time was measured not in days, but in hours. He made the decision to stop taking all life-sustaining drugs, leaving only powerful painkillers to dull the agony of destroyed nerve endings. It was the choice of a man who keeps his hand on the switch of his own fate. He decided to turn off the light himself, rather than wait for the bulb to burn out. But before plunging into eternal darkness, he had to take one last shot, and that shot had to hit exactly on target. Imagine the level of cynicism surrounding this house. In the newsrooms of The Sun and News of the World, layouts for the front pages were already lying ready. They were typeset in advance. Headlines screamed, "King died of plague," "Freddy's dirty secret revealed," "Payment for sins." They were just waiting for the signal. They were waiting for the body to be carried out of the house, to fire up the printing presses and sell millions of copies built on filth, conjecture, and posthumous humiliation. They considered Freddy their prey, already caught in a trap, just waiting for the kill shot. But Freddy, even blind and immobilized, saw this picture clearer than anyone. Lying in the dark, he ran scenarios in his head. If he dies silent, they write his story for him. They turn him into a victim, hiding his essence out of shame. They mix his legacy with dirt, and this thought caused him more pain than the sarcoma devouring his skin. He couldn't allow it. He was Freddie Mercury. He wasn't a victim. He was a predator. And he was going to flip the game the second his enemies were popping champagne. "I want it to be simple," he whispered, and Jim Beach, leaning over him, could barely make out the words. "No drama, just facts, and dignity." Do you hear that irony? The man who built a career on drama, on feathers, on crowns and robes, in his most important moment demanded absolute dry simplicity. Why? Because truth needs no scenery. Lies require decorations, excuses, complex structures. Truth is a naked blade, and Freddy was going to plunge that blade into the very heart of the media machine. He dictated the text, and every word cost him titanic effort. His lungs, ravaged by pneumonia, refused to work. Air wheezed in and out, but he kept speaking. This wasn't a dying man's speech. It was a manifesto. He wasn't going to apologize for who he was. He wasn't going to ask for pity. He was simply going to state a fact, but do it in such a way that the journalists had no room to maneuver left. Have you ever wondered why he included the words about hiding the diagnosis for the sake of his loved one's peace of mind? It was a genius move. With one sentence, he turned his 4-year silence from cowardice, as critics accused him, into an act of nobility and protection. He rewrote the narrative of his life in 5 seconds. He told the world, "I wasn't hiding from you. I was protecting those I love from you." And that was a gut punch to the entire gossip industry. He painted them as aggressors, and himself as a protector. Even on the verge of death, his instinct as a showman and manipulator of public opinion worked flawlessly. He knew how to control the crowd, even if that crowd would be reading his words when he was gone. He directed the world's reaction. He knew that tomorrow, when these lines appeared in print, anger would be replaced by shame and curiosity by grief. Jim Beach wrote, and his hand, used to signing contracts for stadium tours, was trembling. He understood he was holding dynamite. This sheet of paper was supposed to blow up the wall of silence around AIDS. In 1991, this disease was a brand. People were afraid to even say the word aloud. And here, the biggest star on the planet, a rock icon, a man adored by millions, openly says, "I have AIDS." Not a severe illness, not immune problems, but AIDS. He called things by their names. He ripped the mask not only off himself, but off the hypocrisy of society. Freddie understood he would become the face of this disease. He knew his photo would be printed next to terrible statistics. But he went for it. Why? Because it was the only way to leave undefeated. To admit the truth means to disarm the enemy. If you say the worst thing about yourself, no one can use it against you. Twilight thickened in the room, but in Freddy's mind, everything was crystal clear. He felt strength leaving him, cold creeping to his fingertips, but the fire of triumph burned inside him. He did it. He made it in time. He beat them. The Sun wouldn't get its dirty exclusive. They would be forced to print his words, his truth, his finale. He forced the most powerful and unprincipled propaganda machine to work for him. It was his last joke, his last middle finger shown to the system. Do you think he feared death at this moment? No. At this moment, he feared only one thing, not having time to put the period. But Jim Beach wrote the last sentence. I hope that everyone will join with me, my doctors, and all those worldwide, in the fight against this terrible disease. Period. Ink glistened in the lamplight. Freddy fell back onto the pillows. His chest heaved heavily, but his face smoothed out. The tension that had held him in a vice for the last weeks let go. He won this race, a race against time and a race against dishonor. Now he could afford to leave. He knew that tomorrow morning the world would wake up different. He knew that millions of fans would cry, but these would be tears of cleansing, not tears of pity for a caught liar. He gave them the truth they deserved, and he gave it to them himself, firsthand, not allowing intermediaries to distort the meaning. It was an act of incredible respect for his audience, but there was another layer to this strategy that few guessed. Freddy understood that his death would be a planetary event, and he wanted to use this energy, this explosion of attention, for good. He knew that his name would now forever be linked to the fight against HIV, and he accepted it. He sacrificed his privacy at the very last moment to save others' lives in the future. His confession was meant to be a signal. If this happened to me, to Freddie Mercury, it can happen to anyone. Stop burying your heads in the sand. This was his will, not money, not rights to songs, but this call to awareness. Jim Beach slowly folded the sheet of paper and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He felt this paper burning his chest. He realized he was carrying a bomb that would detonate tomorrow at noon. He looked at Freddy. He had already closed his eyes, falling into a morphine-induced doze. The great strategist had finished his game. The pieces were set. The king had made his last move and could now leave the board. But outside the walls of the house, in the damp London night, journalists were still staking out the sensation, unaware that the sensation was already written, packaged, and signed, and that it would destroy their plans, turning their thirst for profit into dust. They waited for the star's defeat, and they got a masterclass in immortality. And when tomorrow this text appears on the teletypes of all news agencies in the world, silence will fall. That very silence Freddy craved so much, the silence of respect. But for now, the clock in the room continued to count down the seconds, approaching the moment when the secret would cease to be a secret and become a legend. Imagine this moment, not as a line in a history textbook, but as a physical sensation. Imagine you are holding the sheet of paper. It is light, almost weightless, but the words written on it weigh more than the entire Queen discography, more than all the gold in the world, and more than life itself. The text that Freddie Mercury dictated in the twilight of his bedroom appeared on the screen. At first, it was just letters, black signs on a white background. But when you start reading them, when you delve into the meaning of every syllable, you realize that before you is not a medical report and not a press release. Before use a testament written in blood and courage. These words fell into the information space of 1991, not like a stone in water, but like a nuclear warhead in the center of a metropolis. Following the enormous conjecture in the press over the last 2 weeks, that's how this message began. Do you feel this tone? This is not the tone of a victim. This is the tone of a monarch addressing his subjects. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't grovel. From the very first sentence, he makes it clear, I heard everything you said about me. I know about your filth, and now I will tell you how things really are." But the real blow, the very moment when the reader's breath catches, followed. "I wish to confirm that I have been tested HIV positive and have AIDS." Try now, in the 21st century, to realize what those two sentences meant then. Today it is a diagnosis. In 1991, it was a brand. It was the mark of a leper. People were afraid to shake hands with the sick, afraid to drink from the same mug, afraid to breathe the same air. To say "I have AIDS" publicly for a star of that magnitude was tantamount to social suicide. It meant admitting you are dirty, dangerous, wrong. Society demanded shame. The church demanded repentance. The press demanded details about where and with whom he caught it. But look at the text. Do you see shame there? Do you see a plea for forgiveness there? No. There's only a dry, razor-sharp statement of fact. Freddy threw these words in the world's face like a gauntlet. He refused to play the role of the repentant sinner. He said, "Yes, this is so. And what will you do about it?" But if you think that was the most shocking part of the statement, you are mistaken. The Santa Barbara effect, the plot twist that flips everything upside down, was hidden in the next paragraph. The whole world accused him of hiding the disease out of cowardice. Journalists wrote that he was selfish, thinking only of his image. And here Freddy gives an answer that makes them shut up forever. "I felt it correct to keep this information private, to date, to protect the privacy of those around me." Do you understand what he did? With one sentence, he turned his silence from an act of weakness into an act of supreme nobility. He rewrote the history of his illness. It turned out that all these 4 years he wasn't hiding like a rat, but standing guard like a lion, protecting his old mother, his sister, his friends from the hell that would have opened up had the press known the truth earlier. He took the hit himself. He allowed himself to be called a liar, just so his loved ones could live a few more years in relative peace. This confession completely changed the optics. From a fallen star, he instantly turned into a martyr and protector. And now think about what was not in this text. This is perhaps the most important thing. The statement contained not a word about how he got infected, not a word about his sex life, no names, dates, excuses. Freddy drew a line. He said, "I have a disease, but my personal life is none of your business." Even dying, he reserved the right to privacy. He didn't let the tabloids crawl into his bed posthumously. It was a masterclass in maintaining dignity. He gave them the fact, the disease, but he didn't give them the juicy details. He left them hungry, and therein lay his final victory over the gossip industry. He controlled the information down to the last comma. However, the time has now come for my friends and fans around the world to know the truth. Friends and fans. Notice, he doesn't address the press. He addresses those who loved him. He ignores the intermediaries. He speaks directly to the millions of people who bought his records. He tells them, "I am honest with you. I didn't lie to you. I was just protecting you." And then follows the finale, which sounds like a battle cry. I hope that everyone will join with me, my doctors, and all those worldwide in the fight against this terrible disease. This was a warrior's manifesto. He knew he was losing his personal battle. His body was destroyed. He was blind and bedridden. But in spirit, he was on the front lines. He called the world not to pity, but to fight. He turned his death into a weapon against the virus. He knew his name would draw attention to the problem, in a way thousands of doctors and politicians couldn't. He sacrificed his privacy at the very last moment to save others' lives in the future. This text lay on the table, and the ink on it had already dried, but it continued to radiate energy comparable to radiation. Jim Beach looked at these lines and realized he was holding dynamite. Every word was measured. Every phrase was honed. There wasn't a single superfluous emotion, not a single tear-jerking note. This was the text of a man staring into the abyss and not blinking. This was the king's text. Have you ever read farewell letters of great people? Usually, they are full of regrets, memories, sentimentality. Freddie Mercury broke that rule too. His farewell was an action. It was a call. It was a mobilization. He was leaving, but leaving behind not emptiness, but a task. Fight. But there was another hidden layer of meaning that became clear only years later. Freddie didn't just admit to the illness. He legalized it. Until that moment, AIDS was a disease of the marginalized, drug addicts, outcasts. Freddie's confession made this disease human. It showed that the virus doesn't choose, that it can kill even a rock god, that everyone is equal before it. This sheet of paper did more for the fight against the epidemic than millions of dollars in government grants. It destroyed the wall of silence. It forced people to talk about it in kitchens, in offices, in schools. Did Freddie know this? Perhaps. His intuition was always supernatural. He understood that his death would be a planetary event, and he decided to channel this explosive energy in the right direction. Imagine the silence that fell in the room after the text was approved. It wasn't the silence of the end. It was the silence before the beginning of something new. Freddie, exhausted by this last effort, fell back on the pillows. His mission was accomplished. He said everything he had to say. Now he could go. He let go of this world. He passed the baton. He was no longer Freddie Mercury, superstar. He became Farrokh Bulsara again, the boy from Zanzibar who just wanted to sing. But this document, this sheet of paper that Jim Beach carefully tucked into a folder, had already begun to live its own life. It was already flying through telephone wires. It was being typed onto teletype tapes. It was preparing to appear on TV screens from Tokyo to New York. Do you feel this paradox? A man dies in a closed room, cut off from the world, but his words at this very moment become the loudest on the planet. That was Freddie's magic. He knew how to be omnipresent. Even when his voice weakened to a whisper, that whisper was capable of drowning out the noise of the crowd. The statement was released on the evening of November 23rd. It was a Saturday. The world was getting ready for the weekend. People went shopping, sat in pubs, watched TV. No one knew that the usual course of things was about to be disrupted. No one knew that in a few hours, millions of people would feel the ground slipping from under their feet. The bomb was dropped. The timer reached zero, and the shockwave of truth was already racing through the wires to strike at the very heart of humanity. But the most amazing thing was that this explosion didn't destroy the love for Freddie. On the contrary, it cleansed it of the husk of rumors and made it eternal. But what was the price of this eternity for the man who remained lying in the dark, awaiting his final dawn? November 23rd, 1991, Saturday. Remember this date, because it was the last day of the old world. A world where ignorance was considered bliss and silence was gold. London wrapped itself in the usual gray fog. People rushed to pubs, watched evening shows, cooked dinner, discussing the weather and football. It was routine, cozy, safe routine that lulls vigilance. None of the millions of people who turned on their TVs that evening suspected that in a few minutes their reality would crack at the seams. No one knew that in the office of PR agent Roxy Meads, a sheet of paper was already fed into the fax machine that would turn this ordinary Saturday evening into a historic milestone. Have you ever felt that strange, vibrating tension in the air before lightning strikes? The minute the clock struck 8 p.m., that tension became physically palpable. The fax started working, first to the Press Association newsroom, then to the offices of the BBC and ITN. The characteristic screeching sound of the fax print head sounded like an air raid siren. Line by line, word by word, the truth seeped into the world, and when news editors tore these sheets from the trays, their faces went pale. They expected gossip. They expected denials. But they received a confession that was like a punch to the solar plexus. The effect was instantaneous and deafening. Imagine a news anchor being handed a sheet marked urgent, live, on air. He reads it to himself, and you see his facial expression change. The professional mask falls off, giving way to human shock. He looks up at the camera, takes a breath, and says, "Freddie Mercury has just confirmed that he has AIDS." At that moment, millions of teacups froze in the air. Conversations in living rooms cut off. Time stopped. But here's the most amazing thing. The public's first reaction was not horror or disgust, as cynics predicted. It was a collective exhale, like a boil that had been maturing for 4 years had finally burst. All those whispers, all those dirty tabloid articles, all those speculations about his health, it all instantly lost meaning. Only the naked, ringing truth remained. But inside this truth lay a trap, that very Santa Barbara effect, plot twist, that forces us to rethink what is happening. People heard the statement, and their brains, clinging to hope, made a mistake. They thought it was the beginning. They thought, okay, he confessed. Now he will start treatment openly. Now he will lead a movement. We have time. What a tragic, heartbreaking illusion that was. The world thought Freddie Mercury had gone on the warpath. They remembered Magic Johnson, the basketball player who announced his diagnosis just 2 weeks prior and looked full of strength. They projected this situation onto Freddie. They thought he was simply moving into a new phase of life. No one, absolutely no one outside the walls of Garden Lodge knew that this statement was not a battle cry, but a suicide note. People thought he had months, maybe even years. They started making plans, benefit concerts, charity foundations, new albums. This hope, flaring up in the hearts of millions, was bright, but it was false. Freddie gave them this hope, knowing he couldn't justify it. Or maybe he gave them something more. He gave them the opportunity to say goodbye to him as a living hero, rather than mourn him as a dead victim. It was his last gift, 24 hours of illusion that things could still be fixed. But let's look at those who were on the other side of the barricades, the journalists, those very vultures staking out his house. As soon as the news went on air, the atmosphere on Logan Place changed radically. An hour ago, it was a hunt. They were predators waiting for the prey to make a mistake. But now that the prey had come out to them with visor raised, the hunt lost its meaning. What to write about now? The secret. The secret is gone. Shame? But there was no shame in the statement. There was pride. Freddie disarmed them. He knocked their main weapon out of their hands, sensationalism. And do you know what happened? These cynical men in smoke-filled jackets, ready to sell their souls for a photo of a dying star, suddenly went quiet. They lowered their cameras. For the first time in many weeks, a silence settled at the gates of Garden Lodge that held more respect than any editorial in the Sun. They realized they had lost this game. A dying man outplayed them all, turning them from inquisitors into mere witnesses of greatness. However, the most powerful transformation was happening not in newspaper offices, but in the hearts of ordinary people. The phone lines at the Queen Fan Club office glowed white-hot and would have melted if it were physically possible. But people weren't calling to turn in their membership cards. They were calling to say, "We are with him." That night, people began to flock to the mansion walls. At first, it was just a few, the most devoted, the bravest. They brought flowers. They brought candles. They brought letters. But by midnight, there were hundreds. This wasn't a crowd of onlookers. It was a spontaneous vigil. People stood in the cold London rain, holding lit candles, and this light reflecting in the wet asphalt became a symbol that Freddy was not alone. The wall he built to protect himself from the world suddenly turned into a wall of weeping and love. If he could have looked out the window, if his eyes could see, he would have seen a sea of lights. He would have seen that the world didn't turn away from him. The world came to embrace him. But inside the house, in that bedroom where time compressed to heartbeats, Freddy no longer heard the news. He didn't know that his plan worked even better than he calculated. He was in a state of semi-oblivion, drifting between worlds. His mission was accomplished. The weight of the secret that pressed on him for 4 years was gone. and it physically reflected on him. Those sitting by his bed, Jim, Peter, noticed his face relax. The tension that distorted his features for the last weeks was gone. He was no longer a fugitive. He was a free man. Can you imagine that feeling? The feeling of absolute total liberation when you have nothing left to hide? It was euphoria mixed with agony. He let go of life because now he could entrust his memory to people. He knew they would understand, and they understood. But there is one more, cruelest twist in this story. The world, having received this confession, breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the worst was behind. Now we know the truth. Now we can help. People woke up on Sunday morning, November 24th, read newspapers with headlines, "Freddy, I have AIDS," and thought this was the start of a new chapter. They discussed it over breakfast. They argued about how this would affect the perception of the disease. They waited for new statements. They waited for interviews. They didn't know that at the very moment they were reading these lines, as they drank their morning coffee, the life of the man they were talking about was hanging by a thread the thickness of a single breath. It was a terrible irony of fate. The world had just met the real Freddy, just accepted him fully, with all his scars and secrets. But Freddy was already leaving this world. He opened the door, let the light in, and immediately exited through the back door of eternity. With every minute of Sunday, the tension at the house grew, but now it was a different tension. It was the expectation of the inevitable, although no one wanted to say it out loud. Doctors came and went with grim faces. Elton John, one of the few allowed into the house in the final days, sent a huge bouquet of flowers, but even he didn't know how little time was left. Everyone lived in a bubble of hope that Freddy himself created with his bold statement. If he found the strength to confess, then he has the strength to fight, so millions thought. It was a logical error dictated by love. We always want to believe heroes are immortal. We refuse to believe Superman can die. And Freddy, even in his ruined state, remained Superman to us. He made us believe he was in control. And in some higher philosophical sense, he really was in control. He controlled the narrative, but he couldn't control physiology. Sunday evening descended on London. There were more and more candles by the walls of Garden Lodge. They formed a ring of fire around the house, like a protective barrier against darkness. People sang Queen songs, quietly, under their breath. "Love of my life, you're my best friend." These songs, written years ago, suddenly gained a new, piercing meaning. They sounded like prayers. Inside the house, Jim Hutton changed Freddy's clothes. He put a clean t-shirt on him and his favorite boxer shorts. Freddy wanted to leave in his home clothes, in the clothes of a human, not a stage character. He was ready. He waited. Did he hear that singing from the street? Perhaps. Doctors say hearing is the last sense to leave a dying person. If so, the last thing the greatest singer of the 20th century heard was the voices of his fans singing to him about love. Is that not the best finale for an artist? To leave accompanied by the love you yourself sowed in the hearts of millions. But the clock kept ticking. The hands relentlessly approached 7 in the evening. The world froze in anticipation of Monday, awaiting market reactions, politicians' reactions, other stars' reactions. No one knew that Monday would never come for Freddie Mercury. No one knew that the bomb he dropped last night was only the first part of the explosion. The second part, quiet, personal, final, was due to happen any minute. And when it happens, the shockwave will be of such force it will knock the whole planet off its feet. But for now, he breathed. And while he breathed, hope lived, even if it was a hope doomed to die. While the world went crazy over the news, while teletypes in newsrooms beat out the rhythm of sensation, and fans bought out flowers in all 24-hour shops in London, in the bedroom on the second floor of Garden Lodge came that very moment usually called the eye of the storm. Have you ever seen the eyes of a cat looking at something invisible to humans? That night, Freddy's favorite cat, Delilah, sat on the edge of his bed. She wasn't sleeping. She looked at her owner with an unblinking gaze, and if she could speak, she would tell us what was happening in this room better than any biographer. Because she saw not a rock star who made a loud statement. She saw a man who had finally thrown off an invisible concrete corset. Making this confession, releasing this sheet of paper into the world, Freddy seemed to cut the last cable holding his hot air balloon to the ground. We are used to thinking that hope gives strength to life, but that night in Freddy's bedroom, another, more ancient and terrible law was in effect. Sometimes it is responsibility that keeps us in this world when the body is long ready to give up. Freddy held on by sheer willpower, on the adrenaline of the secret. He couldn't die, while the secret hung over him like a sword of Damocles. But now the sword had fallen. The secret disappeared, and with it disappeared the need to fight for every next breath. Do you think panic reigned in this room? Do you imagine doctors running with defibrillators, screams, fuss? No. Reality was much more piercing. There was silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the silence of a temple after the service has ended. Jim Hutton, the man who loved Freddy, not for his fame, but in spite of it, sat nearby. He held Freddy's hand, the very hand that once gripped the microphone stand, with strength capable of bending steel. Now this hand was light as a dry branch. Jim felt the pulse under his fingers getting weaker, like the distant echo of a departing train. But on Freddy's face, distorted by disease, emaciated to the state of a skull covered in skin, something incredible began to emerge. It was an expression of deepest, almost childlike relief. The tension that lived in his jaw, in his shoulders, in his forever wary gaze for years, all of it dissolved. He was no longer the great pretender. He didn't pretend to be healthy. He didn't pretend to be strong. He allowed himself the luxury of simply being a dying man. But here's a question that makes blood run cold. Did he understand what was happening? Did he hear the sound of rain outside the window? Did he smell the lilies? Doctors say that in the last hours, human consciousness narrows to a point. But Freddy wasn't an ordinary human. His consciousness always worked on other frequencies. He fell into oblivion and surfaced from it, and in those rare moments of clarity, he didn't look for platinum records on the walls. He looked for the eyes of his friends. Peter Freestone, his personal assistant, adjusted the pillow. Freddy tried to say something, but only a wheeze escaped his throat. He didn't need to speak. They understood each other without words. It was a brotherhood, sealed by years of service and love. They knew he had done everything he wanted. He closed all circles. He recorded Mother Love, singing the last verse, knowing he wouldn't be able to finish it. He filmed a music video, knowing he looked frightening. And finally he told the truth to the whole world. His to-do list was empty, and this emptiness was not frightening, but liberating. At this moment outside, something was happening that could be called a collective hallucination. The world, having read the statement, was sure a new era had begun. People thought, Freddy is a fighter. He challenged the disease. Now, the battle begins. They projected their hopes onto him, their Hollywood movie scripts where the hero finds a miracle cure in the finale, or at least gives a fiery speech. They didn't know the credits were already rolling. This was the cruelest real-life Santa Barbara effect. Viewers thought they were watching the middle of the season, but in reality, they were watching the last seconds of the series finale. Freddy gave them hope so they wouldn't stop him from leaving. It was his last merciful lie. He allowed them to think about the future so they wouldn't poison his present with their hysteria. Jim Hutton began changing Freddy's clothes. It is an intimate, almost sacred process. He took off his sweat-soaked pajamas. Freddy's body was covered in sarcoma marks, bruises from IVs, scars of the battle. But Jim touched him with such tenderness, as if he were the most precious Ming Dynasty porcelain. He put a clean t-shirt on him and his favorite boxer shorts. Notice this detail. Not a stage costume, not a silk robe. but simple, home clothes. Freddie wanted to meet eternity, not as the king of rock, but as a regular guy who loves his cats and his home. He was shedding the skin of a legend to remain simply a soul. And in this changing of clothes, there was more greatness than in all his royal robes combined. He was preparing to meet not fans, but God, and he knew makeup wasn't needed there. At some point, Freddie opened his eyes. His gaze was clouded by morphine, but he suddenly focused on something no one else in the room saw. Maybe he saw the Zanzibar of his childhood, or the Live Aid stage, or just the light spoken of by those who survived clinical death. We will never know. But his lips moved. Jim leaned in, trying to make out the words, but there were no words. There was only an exhale, a long, drawn-out exhale in which the word pee was heard. That's how he wanted to call Peter, or maybe ask to use the toilet, as he tried to maintain independence and dignity to the last. Even on the threshold of death, he was concerned not with greatness, but with simple human needs, the desire not to be a burden. This broke the heart more than any pompous speeches. The greatest voice of the generation was reduced to a whisper, to an attempt to maintain control over his own body, which betrayed him every second. The clock hands relentlessly crawled forward. Night deepened. Candles on the street burned despite the rain, creating a trembling halo around the house. People sang, quietly out of tune, but sincerely. "Love of my life, you've hurt me." This sound seeped through the walls. Did Freddie hear it? Medics claim hearing dies last. Imagine it's true. Imagine that the last earthly sound for him was not the beep of medical devices, but the voices of those he tamed with his music. They were returning the love he gave them for decades. The circle was closing. The energy he poured out onto stadiums returned to him in this small room to warm him on his final journey. But there was something else in this room. Fear. Not Freddie's fear. He had outgrown his fear. The fear of those who remained. Jim, Peter, Mary, they understood that as soon as his heart stopped, their world would collapse. They lived in his orbit, warmed by his light, and now this sun was going out. They feared not death. They feared life after Freddie. A life where there would be silence. A life where his piano would stand closed. They clung to every second, to every beat of his heart, trying to hold him, although they understood it was selfish. "Let him go," said reason. "Don't leave," screamed the heart. And in this struggle of love and inevitability, the last hours of November 23rd passed. Suddenly Freddie's breathing changed. It became intermittent, arrhythmic. This is Cheney Stokes' respiration, a harbinger of the end. Everyone in the room froze. Even Delilah the cat raised her head, ears pricked. She sensed the presence of a guest who cannot be seen but cannot be missed. Death entered the room, not as a skeleton with a scythe, but as a quiet, cool wind. She didn't come to take him by force. She came because he opened the door for her himself with his statement. He invited her. He said, "I am ready." And she accepted the invitation. In this moment, time lost its meaning. Past, present, and future merged into a single point. The point where lay the gold pen that wrote history, and where lay the hand that would never again be able to lift that pen. The world outside the window continued to live, argue, print newspapers, unaware that the center of their universe had already begun to collapse, turning into a black hole that would swallow all their grief, but in return give birth to a new star whose light would reach us forever. And now, I want you to do something you rarely do when watching videos. I want you to stop. Stop perceiving this as a story from distant 1991, as a beautiful, tragic fairy tale about a man you only saw on screen. Turn off the spectator mode in your head that watches someone else's life from a safe distance while eating popcorn. Because now we have reached a moment that concerns not just Freddie Mercury. It concerns you. Right here and now. Ask yourself, what would you do? Imagine you are lying in this room. Your body, which was once your temple, your instrument, your pride, has betrayed you. It has turned into a cage of pain and rotting flesh. You are blind. You cannot get up to pour yourself water. You cannot even go to the toilet without help, and this humiliation burns hotter than fire in your lungs. And outside the window are not friends, not sympathetic neighbors. Outside the window stands a crowd thirsting for your blood. They want to see your fall. They want to photograph your corpse to sell it for a higher price. And you have a choice. Most of us, hand on heart, would choose silence. We would hide under the blanket. We would order the curtains drawn even tighter. We would leave through the back door, quietly, unnoticed, leaving the world to guess and gossip. We would say to ourselves, I owe nothing to anyone. This is my death, and I want to keep it to myself. And no one would dare judge us. Fear of public exposure in a moment of absolute weakness is the most natural human instinct. But Freddie went against the instinct of self-preservation. He committed an act that contradicts the very nature of a dying creature. Instead of curling up and hiding, he stood tall, not physically, but spiritually, and looked into the eyes of millions of people. Would you have the spirit to do that? Would you have the courage to confess to what society considers filthy and shameful, knowing you have less than a day to live? Do you think it was just a press statement? Oh no. It was the greatest gamble in history. Freddie bet everything he had left. His reputation, his memory, his legacy. He knew he risked remaining in history not as a genius musician, but as that guy who died of AIDS. It was a risk that would give any PR manager a heart attack. But Freddie knew a secret inaccessible to ordinary people. He knew that truth is the only way to disarm the enemy. If you tell about your demons yourself, no one can use them against you. By confessing, he stripped the tabloids of their main weapon, the right to expose. He stole the sensation from them, making it his own confession. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of total control. Even losing control over his bowels, over his breathing, over his vision, he retained control over his story. But there is another layer in this moment that reveals itself only if you look very closely. The Santa Barbara effect, that forces us to rethink everything we knew about his egoism. We are used to thinking of stars as narcissists living for applause, and Freddie was the greatest narcissist of all. He loved attention. He bathed in it. But in these final hours, his narcissism transformed into something holy. He used his fame as a shield to cover others. Have you ever wondered why he didn't make this statement earlier? Why not a year ago? Why not a month ago? Because he knew, as soon as he says it, hell will break loose. And he held this hell on his shoulders, not letting it reach his loved ones, as long as he could stand. And only when his legs finally gave way, he allowed the truth to come out. He let the genie out of the bottle exactly 24 hours before the end, so that this genie wouldn't have time to harm those he loved while he was alive, but could protect their memory when he was gone. It was calculated, cold, genius timing. Imagine this degree of self-control. To lie in the dark, feel the cold of death rising from feet to heart, and at the same time calculate the hours for publishing a press release. Too early. Too early. Still too early. Time. This is not the behavior of a victim. This is the behavior of a director editing his final film in real time. He knew that if he died without confessing, he would be called a coward. If he confessed too early, he would be tortured with pity. He needed to thread the needle. Confess, but give no time for reaction. Confess and leave, leaving the world with its mouth open, and he hit it perfectly, like a sniper. But let's get back to you, to the question hanging in the air. Why does this act touch us so much decades later? Because deep down, we all fear the same thing. We don't fear death as such. We fear disappearing. We fear being remembered as weak, sick, helpless. We fear losing face. Freddie Mercury showed us that face can be saved even when only a skull covered in skin remains of it. He showed that dignity is not how you look, but what you say and do in the face of the inevitable. His statement wasn't about the disease, it was about freedom. About the freedom to be yourself until the last breath. About the freedom not to apologize for your life. About the freedom to go out on your own terms. In that room smelling of medicine and lilies, a battle was raging between biology and spirit. Biology said, "You are a nobody. You are a piece of rotting matter. You are no one." Spirit answered, "I am Freddie Mercury, and I decide when the curtain falls," and the spirit won. The gold pen lying on the table became the symbol of this victory. It put a period not in his life, but in an era of ignorance and fear. But the most amazing thing is that Freddy, this great pretender, stopped pretending in his final hour. He took off all masks. He took off the crown, the robe, the diamond tights. He remained simply a man who said, "I am in pain, I am dying, but I am not broken." And it was this nakedness, this ultimate honesty that made him immortal. Do you feel how your attitude toward him changes? Before, you admired his voice. Now, you admire his silence. That very silence he kept for 4 years, and that very word that broke that silence at the right moment. It was a lesson for all of us. A lesson that, even when everything is taken from you, you have the last right left, the right to the truth, and no one, no disease, no tabloid, no force in the world can take that right from you unless you give it up yourself. Meanwhile, the night outside the window grew deeper. The rain didn't stop, as if the London sky was also mourning what was about to happen. Journalists who received the scoop had already sent their materials to the newsrooms. Newspapers were printing. The world was preparing to read the morning news and discuss it over coffee. No one knew there would be nothing to discuss. No one knew the main character of this drama had already left the stage, although his body was still in the scenery. Freddy, having made his statement, had effectively already left. He disconnected from the outside world. He cut the wires. He left us his name, his music, and his truth, and went where there is no pain, no cameras, and no Sun newspaper. But the last step remained, the hardest one, the step from semi-existence into non-existence. And he had to take this step alone. Jim, Peter, Mary were nearby, but everyone enters this tunnel alone. Freddy lay with his eyes closed, and perhaps in this moment he heard not the sound of rain, but that very music he gave to the world. Maybe Bohemian Rhapsody was playing in his head, or Barcelona, or maybe there was silence. That perfect, pure silence he missed so much in his noisy, bright, sound-filled life. We will never know. But we know one thing. He wasn't afraid. Fear remained in that sheet of paper Jim Beach took away. Only love remained in the room, and waiting for the finale directed by a genius. And this finale approached with every beat of his tired heart, counting down the last moments of an era that will never be repeated. London, Kensington, November 1991. The street in front of Garden Lodge resembles not a residential block, but a war zone. Hundreds of paparazzi, like vultures, circle the high brick walls, waiting for the scent of blood to become unbearable. They don't know what is happening inside, but they feel the finale is near. Inside these walls, in the twilight of a bedroom with heavy curtains drawn, lies a man whose voice once made stadiums vibrate from Rio to Wembley. Now that voice is but a whisper. But it is this whisper that in a few hours will thunder louder than any of his hits. You think you know how Freddie Mercury died. You read the headlines. But you don't know what happened in those last 24 hours when physical infirmity clashed with a titanic will capable of rewriting the history of its own death. If you love discovering the untold stories behind music history's most incredible moments, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon because we reveal the hidden gems that shaped the legends we know today.